Hi there, my name is Finn. I'm a flight instructor in the southeast of England, and welcome to this video. We're going to talk today about what to do if you're flying a single engine piston aircraft and you have an engine failure immediately after takeoff. We're going to talk more specifically about, because you're going to have to land it sometime soon, we're going to talk about whether you should be turning around and going back to the airfield or trying to land straight ahead, and why turning around and going back to the airfield is often called the impossible turn. We're going to look into the actual maths behind it, the actual results of what's happened when other pilots have tried to do both those things, a particular AIB report that has sparked my thinking off for this video, and a few other bits and bobs. So, first thing I really want to talk about before we get started is just to put this all into a bit of perspective and talk really quickly about how dangerous and how risky flying light sort of aircraft, general aviation, is. There's a really good way of thinking about this. It's called the micromort, which for every sort of risky action you do, one micromort is defined as having a 1 in a million chance of death. So if doing something, whether it be, I don't know, going swimming in the sea or something, if that, for example, has a 1 in a million chance of death, then that is counted as one micromort. What is it for flying? What is it for other stuff? Well, let's have a quick look. There's a safety report here in the UK. So this is UK data from the last 10 or 12 years or so. And they found that the fatal injury accident rate was about 12 per million. So that's about 12 micromorts per hour of flight. How does that compare to other things? Well, let's have a little look. I've got this infographic up here. If I zoom in a little bit, we can see around 10 micromorts would be one skydiving jump, or riding a motorbike for an hour, or going under general anaesthetic. Slightly safer than general aviation. What we do is hang gliding, about 8 micromorts. Slightly more is going for a swim and drowning. That's your chance of drowning. And the others are mysteriously getting out of bed if you're a young child, but even more dangerous. So I really recommend, if you're sort of curious about how risky what you do is, this is a really great way of looking into it in more detail. And what I will say is that a lot of your risk is down to how we fly, because there's this brilliant report I was reading. It's based on American data, but I imagine it's very similar. And basically what they found was, if I scroll to the right bit, the major causes in non-commercial fixed-wing general aviation accidents. That's the sort of thing we're doing. And it says pretty much 3/4 of all fatal accidents are pilot related. So pilot error, making incorrect decisions, getting yourself into the wrong part. Only about 15% of all accidents were mechanical, and even fewer of the fatal accidents were to do with mechanical failures. But those things do happen, and pilot related accidents could be not flying with enough fuel or not using the carpeet correctly. I think that would really count as a pilot related accident. And that actually brings me on to this AIB report. So I was flicking through, and I really recommend that you get in the habit of keeping an eye on what accident reports go by. If you don't want to look at the actual AIB website like I have here, if you go and subscribe to one of the flying magazines, they normally have a few pages of breakdowns and short analyses that are a bit more sort of brief than these big long reports. But it's really worth learning from other people's mistakes so you don't make those mistakes yourself. There was this report I was reading about, it's happened in June, so it's quite recent, about a Cessna 152, which always pricks my ears up. That's one of the main aircraft I fly and teach on. It's a durable little trainer that's been going for years and refuses to be budged from its position in the training fleet. They're great things. They're really economical to fly, and they're really great to train on. And because I fly them a lot, I try and keep an eye on any sort of accidents that I could learn from as a flight instructor to either change what I do or what I teach, or a bit of both. And so what's interesting is happened in Shopton in Herefordshire. Just one person on board, just the pilot. With a PPL, he's about 35 years old. He hadn't been flying much recently. I'd clearly been sort of 20, 30 hours into his since passing his PPL, we presume. And what really pricked my ears up was this little comment here, where it says here, this report considers why this accident resulted in a good outcome when many previous similar events have resulted in fatal accidents. So what happened was the aircraft suffered a partial engine failure shortly after takeoff. And partial engine failures are really difficult because do you try and soldier on, or do you try and just consider it a total engine failure and just deal with that course? It's a really difficult one, especially if you go down okay, I'm going to consider this a total engine failure, gliding down to the perfect field, and then the engine bursts back into life again. That's why when we're doing our drills, when we practice having an engine failure, we secure the aircraft, make sure that we turn off the fuel, get that throttle closed at a fairly early stage. So you just committed to that action. Now, it says he hadn't flown for a while because of the public health restrictions at the time, and he was up to do some circuits to regain recency, which is wise and legal as well if you wanted to take anyone else up. And he said for the third circuit, when he had the flaps up on full power, as the aircraft reached 300 to 400 feet, the engine lost all power. He immediately lowered the nose, selected the field. He recalled that the power returned briefly and then reduced again, but he decided to just close the throttle and treat it as if the engine had completely failed. I think it was a great decision. He made a quick mayday call and then focused on the landing. He had a slight crosswind landing. He landed, saw a bit of a ditch in his way, so just applied a bit of back pressure just after he'd sort of touched down to get over the ditch, which is in this, which I think is an excellent move. And you can see there the aircraft sat there pretty much unscathed, not a little bit of damage at all. Perfect flat field, not much different from some airfields I've flown from. And well, let's skip a bit ahead. What I wanted to do, because I got thinking, should he maybe have tried to turn around, or should he just landed ahead? Clearly landed ahead really worked for him, but should he maybe have turned back around? So I decided I would, I thought, why even would you want to turn around? And I think there's a real psychological want to return back to your safe haven, back to that airfield, back to the place where you know that you've landed on a millions times. So you're very familiar with it. Whereas I imagine most people watching this video have never landed anywhere apart from an airfield or an airport. Also, you know that you're in a bit of trouble and there will definitely be help there at the airfield, even if it's just someone with a telephone to ring a fire brigade, or whether your airfield's got full rescue and firefighting services. You know there's going to be more help there than at this field. So it's I can really understand why you would want to turn back, given that sort of, given those options essentially. But what I wanted to do was, because I'm a bit of a nerd, I wanted to sit down and do the maths. What does the maths say about the aerodynamics of turning back? How likely is it that you can turn back and get back to the airfield? Or you can end up landing short anyway if you turn back? Or you're going to miss the airfield? What I actually wanted to do was work that out. So I sat down with Microsoft Excel, dug out my aerodynamic textbooks, and really crunched the figures. I based this all on a 152, like this guy was flying. I made some big assumptions. I assumed that you reacted immediately to turning back, and that you'd have to turn, because 180 degrees would have you turn back around but not lined up with the runway. So I've assumed you'd then have to turn another 45 degrees right and then left to get back onto the centre line. I've also assumed that after you turn back, you end up where you started, even though if you did it correctly, well, there's two ways to do it. One, you turn left and then you turn right, and then back on the centre line. Or the other option is you turn 180 degrees around and then turn right a bit and then left a bit to get back on the centre line. But I've assumed you just end up back where you started the turn when you finish the turn. And I've assumed that you're the most perfect test pilot ever and you're excellent at maintaining that best glide speed and thus the best glide angle. So these are quite ideal scenarios, really. Flaps up as well. If you're taking off from a short field, you probably have flaps down, which is going to worsen your glide performance. And I've assumed ISA conditions. This accident actually happened when it's about 29 degrees, so a lot warmer than ISO conditions. So I've not been very conservative in most areas, I would say, when I crunched the figures. I did a really messy spreadsheet that I don't particularly want to show you too much, but just what the big thing I noticed from this is a lot of it is about your angle of bank and the headwind. Those are some really big factors, and also how high you are when the engine failed. So this is what my results were, really. If you just use a 30-degree angle of bank in that turn back to the airfield, and say your engine fails at about 500 feet, so about 100 feet, you're 100 feet luckier than this guy in this accident report. If there's no headwind, then you're going to land 800 meters away from where you took off from. That being said, you lift off from the runway, and if you look out your window, 800 meters further along is where you're going to touch down. If there's, and this gets a bit better with a bit more headwind, as you would expect, because then that comes a tailwind in the glide. And so if you're taking off into a stonking 20 knots of headwind, you can get to about 170 meters away from where you lifted off from. Would I want to bank on that? Is there 170 meters of airfield and runway left from after I lift off? Yeah, probably places I fly. But is there 400-500 meters? No. Am I a good enough pilot to do all these things perfectly? I wouldn't really want to risk my life on it. So what we can see here is this guy totally made the right decision. Totally made the right decision in turning back. And in fact, you can see here that a lot of this is really about the headwind. If you've got 10 knots of headwind, then once you get to 1,000 feet, you can probably make a pretty good go at once you get to 1,000 feet, with 10 knots of headwind, you can probably make a good go at getting back to the runway with a 30-degree angle of bank turn. And if there's a stronger headwind, then you actually start to run into the opposite problem, where if your engine fails at 1,000 feet and you're flying into a 20-knot headwind, you're actually going to have to get down a lot quicker. You're going to have to actually apply some flaps, maybe even side slip, to get rid of some of this height, because otherwise you're going to land 890 meters before you lift it off, and the ground roll on a 152 is way less than this. So if you're not careful, you're going to end up landing past the airfield. So this is certainly some food for thought. This guy definitely did the right thing. There's clearly no way that he could have got back to the airfield with his engine failing at 300 or 400 feet. Landing ahead clearly was the right option. And I did a bit more analysis of this. I looked at what it would say if you did a 45-degree angle of bank turn, which is quite steep, really, a low level. If you are in your early days of your PPL, you probably won't have got close to doing a 45-degree angle of bank turn. It's more later in the course you'll find you do that. And it's something, we practice it when we do advanced turning, steep turns. But it's not to be done lightly at low speed, not to be done lightly at low speed near the ground, for a couple of reasons we're going to come on to in a second. But it does improve your chances of getting back to the runway. Still, if there was no headwind, you're basically not going to get back to the runway. But as soon as you start to fly into 10 knots of headwind or even more, from 700 feet, it's close. You probably just about do it. But certainly, if you get to 1,000 feet, again, you start to have that problem before, where if you don't add some flaps in, then you're going to be landing past the runway. And certainly when you go into a strong wind, if you're able to use a 45-degree angle of bank turn in the strong wind, you can almost certainly get back from quite a low level, according to these figures here. Now, this isn't taking into account various different factors, as we mentioned before. You have to be an amazing pilot, perfect aircraft. That's not the situation we're in. So take all these with a pinch of salt. But it kind of gives you a bit of an idea about what's possible. The reason I'm not really keen on the 45-degree angle of bank turn, or relying on that, is really what it does to our stall speed. In the Cessna, the best glide speed in a 152 is 60 knots. The stall speed at 45 degrees angle of bank is pretty much 48, basically 50 knots. So you've only got a 10 knot difference there. And I can imagine it doesn't take much in a stressful situation when you're really eager to get back to the airfield to just move that control column to, you're gripping tight, you're probably quite stressed, to just pull it a bit towards you and end up stalling, and all of a sudden you're stalling at 45 degrees angle of bank, close to the ground, a few hundred feet to recover. All of a sudden you're and you haven't got any power, you're in a place that you don't really want to be. And this is why it's often called the impossible turn, because often people will try and make the turn and stall and enter either a stall and not have the altitude to recover, or they'll, even worse, enter a spin. And as soon as you start to enter a spin, you're going to need, really, at least 1,000 plus feet to recover. It's something I certainly wouldn't do unless I was at least at 3,000 feet, if not higher, and I'd want to be recovering by 2,000 feet. And this is often why it's called the impossible turn, because often this is how people end up killing themselves and the people they're flying with, is by having an engine failure after takeoff and then trying to get back to the airfield and messing up the turn. And I think that is what this report is alluding to when it's saying that this outcome was perfect. The guy walked away, the aircraft was unscathed, compared to, well, the worst outcome. So that's why it's often called the impossible turn. And there's also, I'd really point you towards having a look at what history says about this. An excellent article recently in the Flyer magazine by David Joyce, who's done some amazing analysis from about 20 years of accidents. You can read this for free. In fact, if you just head to the Flyer website and find their summer 2020 edition, and then head over to page, I think it's about page 40. There's this brilliant article here about whether you should turn back or not. He looks at about 20 years of engine failure after takeoff accidents, and I think does a really good balanced piece. So I'd really recommend, I don't want to steal his thunder, so I really recommend you go and read that. And this isn't an advert for Flyer, but I subscribe to them and I think they're excellent, so I would recommend you do the same. And basically what he found was, and this is the table that really struck home for me, is those that turn back, when you looked at it, it's about 50-50. Half the people turn back after having an engine failure, be it full or partial, and about half people landed ahead. Those that ended in fatal crashes was about 28%. Those that ended in fatal crashes when they landed ahead was less than 5%. So, if we round that to 30 and 5, that's also, we've almost got almost six times more likely to have a fatal accident, according to historical data, if you try and turn around. Okay, so clearly we've looked at the maths, and it supports landing ahead most but not all of the time. We've looked at the history, it supports landing ahead most, maybe not all the time, it depends on every circumstance. There's one runway I fly from Red Hill quite often off to the north, where there's a big ridge in front of you. There's like a vineyard and allotments, and there's a runway off to my left that I always think is a really great one to land in, but after that's gone behind me, I can imagine it being really difficult to fight the urge to not turn around when the options aren't great. So what can you take away from this? How can you not become a statistic? One thing I would say is practice your engine failures after takeoff away from the airfield, away from the ground as well. Do these at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet. Maybe even try these impossible turns at sort of 2,000 feet and see what happens. Get yourself set up for the climb in the after takeoff configuration. Pull the power back to idle, don't forget using that carpet, and try and turn around and see at what altitude you would get back to the point where you started this. See how much height you lose in that turn. How good is this maths I've done? How accurate is that? How good is your flying? How close to that stall do you come? Do you start to hit that stall warning when you try to go to 45 degrees angle of bank at 60 knots? Ooh, probably. So go practice these engine failure after takeoff manoeuvres away from the airfield and away from the ground. On your next takeoff, really look around you. look around you. What are your options? This is your time when everything's going right to look around and think, well, what would I do if I did have an engine failure after taking off from this runway, from this airfield? If in doubt, if this does happen to you, if in doubt, just land ahead. Clearly, if you're not quite sure, just land ahead, take your chances. The stats, the maths, the historical data is on your side for landing ahead. And really what we can learn from the NAR report that says that 3/4 of these accidents are down to us as pilots is a lot of the time, if you read a bit deeper, this is fuel mismanagement. So maybe we haven't drained the fuel to check there's no water in it. Maybe we haven't taken enough fuel with us. Maybe we're not in the right tank. Maybe we haven't correctly used the fuel pump, depending on what aircraft we're using. Maybe this is we haven't used carburetor heat properly on the ground. We haven't checked it properly. Maybe we've taken off with an unacceptable mag drop for some reason, or unacceptable oil pressure. Whatever it is, have we dropped something in the fuel tank and just sort of ignored the fact that think we might get away with it? A lot of the things that cause these accidents are from us not doing proper checks or following proper procedures. So don't skip them. You're taught them for a reason. Stick to them. If you're in your PPL, make sure you're learning them properly. If you've passed and you're flying around, don't start cutting corners. Stick to what you've been trained, and that'll keep you safe. And really, my big thing, and actually if we go back for a second and look at this accident report, it says here the pilot, and clearly AIB support this, otherwise they wouldn't have printed this. It says the pilot attributed the safe outcome to having planned and reviewed his actions in the event of an engine failure prior to taking off. This meant when he was flying that he freed sufficient capacity that when the worst did occur, he'd already made his decisions, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he could just focus on flying the aircraft. He also treated the partial failure as a complete failure. Having read about previous accidents, he was not tempted to turn back and instead selected the field ahead, focused on the landing. So this guy has done totally the right thing. He's read up about previous accidents, he's watched videos like this, or read articles like that Flying Magazine article, or maybe he sat down like me and done the cold, hard maths. And he's also briefed himself on takeoff. And I want to show you a document that one of the flight schools I fly with have here. If you go to Red Hill Aviation, I'm sure they won't mind me sharing this, and their initial training download section. If you go to the passenger, I think it's called the passenger briefing section. Where is it? Yes, linked to passenger brief crib sheet. Brings up this really great passenger briefing to do before, but actually this is what I think is brilliant. Print this out on A4, fold it over, laminate it so it fits in your knee board or your checklist or by your map. And this is an excellent departure brief. This is tailored for Red Hill, but you can tailor it to wherever you operate from. And it says, look, in an event of engine problem, this is what I'm going to do. You know, if I haven't rotated, I'm just going to stop, or if there's run remaining, I'm just going to land back on, or if there's not, this is my bed glide speed, and I'm just going to select a field to land in and carry out my checks and make a radio call if there's time. And really, I'd agree wholeheartedly with what the AIB and what that pilot said, in that make your decisions on the ground for this. Make your decisions on the ground. Brief yourself before you take off, and then when it does happen, your little our little monkey brains don't need to start stressing about and making decisions, which is kind of hard work. All we need to do is just fly the aircraft. We've made the decisions already, and this is what will really keep you safe. So look, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed my nice little ramble about the impossible turn and why I think it can be impossible, although it's not entirely always possible or impossible. Depends a lot on your altitude, the headwind, what angle of bank you can use for that turn. Go practice it away from the field. You may be shocked by the results and how well or not well it goes. And I'd say, if all else fails, land ahead and don't forget to brief yourself before you go. And any questions, pop it in the comments below here or send me a little email. And also go follow me on Instagram @flywithfinn. Thanks.